Julie Denslow, and I am here talking to Chuck Schnell, who was resident director, then associate director of OTS, stationed in Costa Rica during the 1980s and 90s. And we are at the 50th anniversary meeting of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation and the Organization for Tropical Studies. So, Chuck, I'd like just to start to get a sense of your history and how you found your way to Costa Rica and then stayed.
Well, I first came as an undergraduate abroad student from Grinnell College in a program that was funded, the Associated Colleges of the Midwest program, ACM. It was funded by the same Army Advanced Research Program that funded OTS and ATB, and the Tropical Science Center, a life zone research project that we ACM students went out in the field with. And we had small planes and helicopters that took us all over Costa Rica, which then was 80% forested and didn't have roads to many places.
And you were undergraduates, yes?
We were undergraduates, and we went out and did things. I studied, for instance, melastomes, a family of plants, in their relation to the life zones. Can you use melastomes to tell life zones apart? That kind of thing, as well as other things with the melastomes, which I eventually ended up doing my PhD thesis on.
And what happened?
Well, that was a very interesting year, very successful year. I met in October as I was collecting plants, and I had a plant drying facility going in the Tropical Science Center office. So we were based in the Tropical Science Center. I met Don Stone when he came down with, I think it was 3 or 4 colleagues. One of them I had known from Harvard, or I later knew at Harvard, who was a grad student there, a botanist. And I helped Don dry several days of plant collections, and we were up till past midnight in the office, putting in papers and putting in blotters and putting them in dryers and drying them. So that's how I got to know Stone, and I've been helping him out ever since, at least during my OTS career. I'm going to go a few more years and help him out wherever he is now. So at the same Tropical Science Center office, which was in the center of San Jose, a block from the cathedral, it was down there, we students it was a wonderful area because you could go out at night, you could go everywhere. If you were over 18, you could have beers, although nobody even charged you for that. San Jose had, all the streets went both ways back then. And there were never any traffic jams. And there was all sorts of wonderful places you could walk to and see, and it was a great environment. But at that same office, Bob Hunter, who was the director of our ACM program, also had charge of the ATB at that time, Association for Tropical Biology, journal. And in his desk, whenever you wanted to see him, he had piles of articles and stuff he was reviewing, he was editing. So the ATB also I knew about ATB in 1965, this was. And then I knew about OTS because they were all talking about OTS. We met OTS people. Don Stone came down under OTS auspices as a faculty member. I'm not sure if he was still at Tulane or if he'd just gone to Duke. I can't remember, but anyway, so OTS, ACM, the Tropical Science Center Research Project, and ATB are 4 things all funded by this effort of the U.S. government through the Defense Department to get young people and scientists interested in the tropics. Of course, they did it because they were getting hung up in Vietnam and other places, and they needed U.S. academics to be able to handle problem solving and information and research and so on, relevant to those kinds of international efforts that the U.S. was getting into. The French were pulling out of their tropical thing. All the tropical countries after the Second World War that had been colonized were being decolonized, and independence was setting in and that kind of thing. And the U.S. was needed academic expertise to fill a role, which has been filling, not necessarily in ways we all agree with, but it certainly has been building on all of this kind of thing. And the Army Advanced Research Projects, is it Army, ARPA? It's Advanced Research Projects of the Defense Department, was funding then all these, very innovatively funding all these organizations, which are now celebrating simultaneously their 50th anniversaries. Because ACM also may not be celebrating it with you, but it's their 50th.
So ACM was, I was not clear on that. ACM was set up at the same time.
Same time, it was an effort to get undergraduates into tropical things earlier on. And OTS was the graduates and the researchers. So it was another target to get them into tropical research and training.
Do you have recollection about how, who were the people that put ACM together?
Well, I'd have to think.
Colleges or who were there were Midwestern colleges.
Right, it was a consortium of perhaps about 20
Yeah.
Midwestern small colleges. It included Grinnell, Beloit, Coe, Lawrence. I'm running short. There's many, McAllister, and there was many others, several of which aren't still members of that consortium, and others have come in. So today's consortium looks different, but they're still running their Costa Rican program, which I think is one of their oldest, or their oldest one. And of course, you have another OTS alum, Chris Vaughn, who's now directing that program, and came down a couple years after I did. And so I came back after that year. I came back in 1968 with an OTS course, not officially. I drove down from the States with Jim Rodman. Jim Rodman was with me by that time at Harvard. We were grad students. We got a grant to come down, and he was going to go to the OTS botany course that started in the Lanzatilla Botanical Gardens in Honduras, and then came down to Costa Rica. I drove him down, and since we were there, and they invited me, Herb Baker, who was heading that course, invited me to go with it, and I became friends with the couple of field assistants who were running it, and I became a third unofficial field assistant. We'd load the buses and stuff, right? And I went to I later in Costa Rica rejoined them, and we went to almost all the sites together, right? So I didn't actually take the course, but I was there all the time. And that's how I got to know a lot of the OTS staff too, and so on. That was 68. And then in 69, I never saw the astronauts land that summer in July 69, because I was down doing the advanced course with Dan Jansen and Gordon Orients and John Vandermeer teaching it. And I had been invited that summer and had tentatively agreed to go with John Terberg to Peru, where he was on a 4,000 meter elevational climb with the birds, how the bird communities vary over elevation. And he wanted somebody to do that with the melastomes. And I've been doing melastome lifezones here, and lifezones here, so perfect. But when I heard that Vandermeer particularly, because I really knew him and Jansen, I didn't know Gordon, but when they were doing an advanced course, I said, even though I hadn't taken the basic OTS course, they let me in because I've been a year in Costa Rica and so on. And we had a wonderful summer, a wonderful, life-transforming course experience, right? That course, it was the first course, I think, where they actually did statistics on, they practiced doing statistics, because we had a bank of Monroe calculators. We go, and we use those calculators, in fact, to invert matrices and calculate competition coefficients. And we did very advanced statistics with Monroe calculators. Just on that theme on the calculators, I think in the 1970 course I was with a year later, or a couple years later in 1970, or next year, they brought down the first electronic calculator to use in a course. The office took it for their own use. We got it back. We took it out in the field. It was about that long. It was about that wide, right? It was a big, long, big thing. And I think it was an HP. I'm not sure the brand. And, it was electronic, right? You didn't have to do but it was much more clumsy than Monroe's in terms of packaging, and more delicate and stuff. And then Texas Instruments things came in, and different generations, and everybody did it on those things. And so in 1969 I was down here, and I was also down to start my thesis research year, which I was doing on another system on bees and plants. I basically planned to do the thesis that I told Ray Heithaus about when I was down here, and he went off and actually did it in Guanacaste. I took all the data, but I never actually analyzed it and wrote it up. And I got back, when I finally did my thesis, to the melastomes and to the revision of a genus. But, I was doing the niche divisions and, niche breadth questions and so on. And my whole interest at the time was, how do we explain tropical diversity? And we were using this MacArthur model of, niches, and do you fit more species into the environment because they have narrower niches and you can squeeze more in? Is the environment wider, or do you have overlapping niches? Wider being wider and more productive, yeah. Or do you have, overlapping niches and so on, and maybe some randomness and which ones get where, when, and so on. And I actually got some good data and gave a couple of seminars on that to OTS crowds at the University of Costa Rica in 71, 72. But I just never published it, which was
I remember in the 71 course you're talking about Nelliston.
well.
Yeah, yeah.
I did that though with I did it with the niche breath thing. I did it with several things, but one of them was with epiphytes. Because in the 69 course, John Vandermeer had done something of the sort in Guanacaste with epiphytes, seeing how broad or narrow their niches were. So I started to replicate that kind of thing at different elevations and different climates. I started with communities where one of the bromeliads was actually in almost all of them, and going from single species to some of the most complex had about 32 species of epiphytes in the system, right? And then you ask, well, as you filled into more species, and these are in short trees in pastures, how did these species fill in? And so that was sort of my research interest at that time. That and island biogeography applied to ecological islands, which we did both with flowering plants like shrubs and pasture stuff, different size, different distances, and the insects in the flowers, thrips and so on, diversity. We also did it with coral reef patches, and we used to go to San Andres Island, and we did coral reef. You probably did that with me.
Yes, I did.
You were then with me in the 71 course.
That's right.
I see.
That's
Well, but
right.
before that, so I was down all 69, and around to the end in 70, Mildred Mathias and Tom Moore had me be a visitor in the first week or two of their course for young faculty members. So they had an OTS course for young faculty members, but they seemed to like what I was doing, so they had me come back basically for all the rest of the weeks. I think I was off for a week, and then they said, look, and we ended up by going to San Andres, and so I was developing field problems and stuff of that sort at that time in that course, and then we used them for your course in 1971, which I came back for. First, I started working at UNA, the National University here.
That's right.
And that was in 1974. I did an informal consulting job, a volunteer consulting job with them. They had a new environmental science school, and Rolando Mendoza, who was the founding director that had been appointed for that part-time, he's a biologist, he asked me to give them an idea of what I thought they could do, what the problems would be, what should a new environmental science school in a place like Costa Rica be doing, and I gave them that. And then they hired me in February of the next year, 75, and I started there. I worked there for a total of about 10 years altogether. And we started doing field-based learning, and we took a lot of the OTS kinds of approaches to teaching students stuff into our ecology and forest ecology courses and other things. And I convinced the university to join OTS. And we were going to join it, I think, in 1976, but we were stopped by a certain vice minister for research at the University of Costa Rica, who will remain unnamed, but who stepped in at the last minute and said something that was blatantly untrue about this was impossible or something, and the board got cold feet and didn't admit him. But a year later, they did admit UNA, and I became a board member. And then I think in 1980, I was elected vice president for planning on the executive committee. And I replaced, I think it was Charles Douglas, was the guy at the University of Georgia. Is that his name? Charles, I think maybe Douglas. Steve Preston nominated me. And so I was on the board, on the executive committee, the first of the 80s. And then when Flor Torres was leaving, Don Stone asked me if I would become resident director, Costa Rica resident director, when she left, which I did. He had me do a trial period in '82, and I think it was the month of September. She was away for a month, and I covered the office, and then I started, I believe, in early January, maybe it was December of that year, or maybe it was early January of '83. And so then I worked as basically head of the Costa Rican end of OTS, and in fact, because we expanded programs, Central American and some Latin American programs, all the way up through '98, I think it was, when Jorge Menez came in. I stepped down and he replaced me. I believe in the books or the documentation for this symposium, it says '97, and that's not right. Yeah, as it happens.
Okay. We'll make a note.
Any rate,
Yeah.
so then I came over from UNA. I was going to be a quarter time teaching at UNA, keep my foot in the teaching, but I couldn't really, that became unviable. There's just too much traveling, as we can't have steady classes and still do that. So I basically resigned at UNA, cut off my good start towards a pension and stuff like that, right? And threw in my lot with OTS. And so that's where I was all the way up for 15 years, basically.
And have you got any good stories that you can tell on tape?
Well, there's quite a few. I mean, what I try to do is not, before that position in Costa Rica had basically been doing Don's bidding. It was the ideas of the organization were coming out of North Carolina, and Don's a great leader and had a lot of ideas and stuff. And he would spend hours each day on the phone with Floor, talking and telling her, what to do, what to say, and basically micromanaging, which is very likely needed or whatever. He had done that previously with Jorge Campopadal, kept close tabs, daily tabs on, pretty much daily tabs on what's going on. If not that, 2-3 times a week phone calls. And we started that way, but I finally had to tell him, look, Don, I gotta do stuff. I can't just be on the phone with you, whatever. And I tried to do several things that I had started as a board member, actually, and then I tried to continue as staff, one of which was get OTS more involved with its host country. So initially, OTS didn't include all the national public universities, right? We had to get the others in. Initially, when I knew it, La Selva was pretty much an enclave community, and OTS itself was kind of an enclave of foreign scientists, U.S. scientists working in Costa Rica, but with almost no relation to, individually they would have relations. They'd have friends in the University of Costa Rica and their colleagues right in their fields or something. But institutionally, with just very little relation to its host country. La Selva was a place where you spoke English. Staff spoke Spanish, right? And out behind in their ambits, but out in public, it was nobody spoke Spanish almost. It was a very different place than what you see now. And field assistants for the research projects were almost always brought down. They were grad students, undergrad students that were hired for a year. They'd be in the field, measuring whatever on spectrophotometers and stuff in the lab, taking samples. But they were always kids from the U.S., and it was great. I mean, it was a good chance for them. But we never had, as we do today, Costa Rican field assistants, right? Or virtually never, right? Maybe 1 or 2 exceptions that at the time were good examples. So I just encourage people to get involved and encourage in different ways, not always directly. I mean, I encouraged people running La Selva, including the Clarks when they came. They were very willing and helped. They were big on that. I mean, that was good. So we had a lot of help, but we all tried to get this shifted and get Costa Ricans involved. Institutionally, get the members involved, starting things like Costa Ricans on boards or boards of visitors, when that came in some years later. Just all the different ways I could think of, get the organization involved with its host country. One of the things we did, I was telling you earlier, that among other things, we took active parts in planning the park system and so on. We did some consulting things for U.S. aid on which parks should be supported. We actually plumped for Braulio Carrillo, as opposed to putting that money. It had to go one of 2 places. It could have gone into Corcovado. We would love Corcovado, but we thought Braulio Carrillo was more of a priority at that moment, because it was the new road had just been put through a few years before, and it was in danger of being lost, right, trashed, that whole steep slope. Whereas Corcovado would probably keep perking along, and so we recommended that, and they followed it. OTS at the time, or shortly thereafter, funded the extension through the Zona Protectora to La Selva. We got that with Rebecca Butterfield's volunteer work into nominated as a World Heritage Site. I mean, we helped the Costa Rican entities that needed to do that because we ghost wrote it and stuff. So we just helped in many ways consolidate things in Costa Rica. One of the most important things that perhaps was contributed was our environmental education program, which we had taught starting at UNA, but then at OTS we thought we should have environmental education, but it shouldn't be preaching down to people as some programs were. It should be involving people, and we thought that, contrary to what the national parks had been doing, that the people living in communities around the parks shouldn't be seen as the enemy. They should be, and we shouldn't be bringing in young kids from San Jose who don't know much about wild areas or the parks or the jungle to be the guards, and to be the the ones who are then keeping the people out, but they don't even know their way around, right? The people can sneak by them, if they want to hunt. I mean, that's not, whatever. It was just sort of, we thought we should have more of an integration, so we said we could start around La Selva. And we were going to do participatory community development kinds of approaches, which were well developed in other fields, right? They've been used in different places. We read stuff by Lincoln, somebody, an agricultural person, Lincoln, I can't remember, but from Africa and Asia, we read there was a lot of literature stuff. We had a little symposium, 1 week symposium, where all the local experts on participatory methods, some that they use them with unions, labor unions, some that were used with rural municipalities and communities, and we got them together to try to come on methodologies. And it turns out that we thought it was different. There'd be a fight, but there wasn't. They all agreed. These are the basic principles. So we then got our environmental education people, was Annie Chavez, but then very quickly Luis Fernando Murillo and others, who became very expert promoters, facilitators, going into communities and trying to get them to map their situation, get them to map what their problems were, what their solutions, what their resources were. And among many other things that would come out as their priorities, some of the things would be environmental. They needed water, or they needed maybe sanitation, they needed wood, firewood was getting scarce, whatever, the thing, forest access, hunting access, that kind of thing. So they came out with all sorts of things that were environmental related, and then we'd follow up with them, the program, it basically helping them. It wasn't we would do them, the idea was we'd help facilitate, induce them looking for their own sources that they could identify, and getting what they needed, inputs, sometimes financing, but very often just in kind, or legal changes, municipal ordinances, stuff like that, and it solved these problems. Well, as a result, these communities became very close to the protected areas that we were running, not only in La Selva, but then later around Palo Verde and around Las Cruces. And they became big supporters of OTS and of its field stations. So we had, for instance, at one point, somebody had told the La Selva municipality, the Sarapiquí municipality, that what was the addition to La Selva across the river, Sarapiquí River, what's that called? It was an agricultural place.
La Guardia.
La Guardia, right. They claimed that, that there was a right-of-way there, and they claimed a bunch of things.
Right.
The municipality came out,
Traditional access.
something like that, and no, but they said there had never been a gate, and we'd put it, and but we brought them out there, and we had them look at the old half-rotten gate posts and the fallen-over gate, but the main thing was that all the communities came, and so the municipal, powers that be, all of a sudden there's hundreds of people who want OTS to be here and to support them.
Pretty cool. Chuck, you remember the history of the establishment of the Spanish language?
Courses?
Courses is part of that.
Well, the history, that's right. One of the things I want to do is get OTS more involved with its host country and host region, and the Spanish language courses were very important. There had been a small Spanish language course that was smaller, shorter, and sort of a weak sister kind of course that had been running, that people had started, and it ran 2 or 3 times, I think, maybe 4 times, probably in the late 70s, maybe the first couple of years of the 80s, and then it was stopped. There wasn't funding. So I was trying to look for ways to get that course back, sort of the fundamentals course in Spanish, put it on a par with the English course in terms of opportunities and funding and stuff, change it in terms of it had to be adapted, it did need to be done. People from these countries need to know what coffee or banana looks like. They know that. There's a whole lot of things they already know. And so they have to focus on things that they might be weak on. As in the English fundamentals course, there might be other things that those students are weak on. And so we did 2 things. We tried to get more cross-pollination between those 2 kinds of courses, and we started getting more local students into English language courses. And we always had a few that might go into, if they were Spanish-speaking candidates, they would sometimes go into Spanish courses instead of the English courses, even if they were from the States. We wanted to have some cross-pollination. And we started getting enough success in not only the fundamentals course, tropical biology in Spanish, which had another name, I think, but we got agroecology going, and we eventually got park management things, and we got a whole range of different courses, so that by the time I left, 15 years later, we were giving far more courses to far more students in Spanish than we were in English. So I thought that was sort of a good thing for OTS to have been doing.
Yeah, absolutely. My impression today is that the Spanish language courses are, well, they're certainly more heavily subscribed than some of the English language courses. And the other thing I remember is the struggle to incorporate a management policy side in courses so that you were bringing down both social scientists, economists, agronomists, together with the sort of basic biology, ornithologist, and so forth.
That's right. That's right.
So insights into that whole effort?
We did a whole decision maker program, which that was very much a collaboration with North American office. All of it's totally collaborative, total like that. There's no differentiation. In fact, we actually, where we had sort of a hierarchical and separate structure of the offices, we very much integrated them functionally. We integrated them in terms of budgets and stuff, right? I mean, I remember the time when we used to be trying to cut down our budget. We cut down our communications budget by not using the phone calls all the time, which was, at one time we were spending $30,000 to $40,000 a year on phone calls. We wanted to cut that down by using the brand new technology, email, but we found it didn't go down. And the people in the North American office continued to use the phone because it was easier, but I didn't realize it then. All of their phone bills were on our budget. So they had so we restructured budgets so that everybody was, whatever.
Yeah.
So part of that, this is a great collaboration of decision maker courses, because we were talking with, what foundation, was it Mellon that started that? Or we were talking down here with one of the foundation people. They thought it was a great idea. It was Ford that started the original support on that. But Lucinda McDade wrote up the proposal and got the money. We started giving it in the first place for a congressional, we thought Congress people would come. Not one ever signed up, as far as I know. Maybe one did sometime, but we got congressional aides in different committees or different congressmen that had some reason, to be interested in being in the tropics and learning. And it was a great success. We were getting 20 a year down here, and then we had, after 8 or 10 years, we had a lot of them, of course, leave, but we'd have over 100 that we'd still have reunions with pretty much every year up in Washington. And sometimes I'd go, or there's sometimes others, but a couple of us go, somebody from North American office, somebody from Costa Rica, and we get them all together for lunch, and that was, that was golden. I mean, many people up in high places knew about us and were approving things. For instance, when we had a problem with USAID, I'm getting ahead of myself, but we needed to fund the second phase of the trials project on the Pacific side. USAID had asked us to submit a proposal back when proposals were unsolicited. And then they funded it. They were going to fund this trials, the forestry native species trials project. But at the last minute, for cuts and stuff, they cut it. And the head guy in AID told me, whom I knew very well, been working with for years and so on. He told me, we're very, very sorry. It's we think this is very important, and but our funding got cut, and whatever. So people in North American office were able to contact a couple of the senators whose assistants had come several different times, and those senators, or they probably contacted more, but 2 senators wrote letters to the ID saying, you don't want to do this. And that's how we got the trials project actually funded.
And speaking of which, say something about the thoughts and designs behind the trials project and how that got
Well, that was another one.
established.
I didn't finish saying on the decision maker courses that we then started doing them in Spanish also for local decision makers, not just from government, but from private sector. And that went on for a number of years, and we also got a grant, I think from Ford Foundation, somebody, to do it all over Central America. So we started doing it for 3 years, once a year in each of the Central American countries. Not us, we would go there and we would facilitate, we would catalyze it, we would fund the thing, but we got local NGOs, local people, the local Parks Foundation or whatever we thought was the best venue to organize and give these courses for their incoming, especially after they had elections, for incoming legislators and incoming officials. And the best time is to do it before they actually are in office and they're too busy to do any courses. And you just expose them to environmental questions of all sorts. We don't claim to have the answers. I mean, the congressional assistants kept saying, well, what do you want us to do about this? Like they thought we were going to lobby them on. They said, no, we want you to see what the problems are, see what the complexity of things are, and think about things that you might want to do. So anyway, you asked me about the Trials Project.
Yeah.
The Trials Project,
And I guess for starters, just say something about what it was.
Right.
What was.
well, it was native trees, testing native tree species to see if they could become good on-farm forestry candidates. Would they grow wood fast enough to be planted in small plantations on farms around the area? The context was that we had just spent what was the largest international financial campaign for conservation up to that date with Nature Conservancy and World Wildlife to fund the Zona Protectora down to La Selva. And we put all those resources in it, and the idea is we're going to conserve biodiversity, but is that just an abstract thing, or does it help the country? So some of us said, well, one way it might help the country is if we could actually find out if the trees that live in the same zones that in other parts of this mountain range are being farmed, can those trees be used, and we keep the native trees growing in on-farm plots? And if they're small plots and stuff, maybe mixed plots and that kind of thing, it's a good way of keeping some forestation going, but it's also going to give the farmers an income. Because the Costa Rican Forest Service had just started a few years before a big program to drive reforestation efforts. They realized the country was now not 80% forested, but more like 25%. And then, it was kind of disastrous on these steep slopes, and they wanted more reforestation. But they were bringing people in to plant pines and malina, teak. There are 5 species that are known to international foresters. That's what you plant in a big, but commercial, basically. They're set for commercial reforestation projects, and they're probably very good in that. And they're fast growing and whatever, they're reliable. And Cartier had done a lot of research on the kinds of seeds that worked in Costa Rica and stuff. But they weren't working for small farmers. And we thought we might have an alternative. So we tried over 100 species. There's small trial plots you do to sort out the ones that don't work at all and the ones you can manage. You collect the trees by having people learn to climb the trees or whatever. How do you collect the seed from the right trees? And we've got a lot of people learning a lot of local people learning how to climb trees and get the seed and how to mature it, how to handle it. We worked out protocols for all those species. They chose in the end, after doing tests on La Selva, but also tests with small farmers on the farmers' plots. So the farmers would donate their land, and if the trees were successful, they would eventually keep the harvest, right, the trees. They worked with us in collaborative research to find out which trees grew well. They finally came up with a half a dozen or a dozen, I can't remember exactly, that they could really recommend for some of them for different soils or different elevations, but really grew, and they all grew much faster than the 5 international standards, right? So it seemed to be a very good result. And you also had, as I recall, around 200 different farms involved, farmers and farms involved around the Sarapiquí and down into Guapolí's area in the hills and stuff. And on the other side, in the Pacific side, you had a large number of actually was being done on farms by farmers. So you're finding out what the real results are. We would have experimental plots both at Las Cruces and at La Selva, and the ones at La Selva at least been used for a great many other kinds of research, soils and other kinds of things, right? And as monospecific, some of them are mixed, most of them are monospecific communities. You can see what happens to bird fauna or butterfly fauna or insect, in simple communities as opposed to complex forest and so on. So they've been used for a lot of things, but they're also out there on the farmers' plots where they help with the advice of the project staff. They did all sorts of experiments themselves to see what would work best, what they thought would work, and they're sitting out there. The idea was that many of them talked. They said, well, in 25 years, I can harvest these. They would say, I'm going to use it to pay my kids' university.
Yeah. I remember trying to talk some techs in Puerto Viejo that were working for the GAPS project into planting trees as a way of investing, and instead of putting money in the bank, and which at that time when you had a lot of inflation and so forth from instability of the clone, those trees were always going to be a good investment.
Because these were things, I don't remember the exact species, but they were mahoganies, rosewoods.
Yeah.
We were trying some very valuable timber species, some good
Vochysia,
number of which,
yeah.
Vochysia was one.
Yeah.
What's the one that's in the poison? Anacardia? Maybe that was on the other side.
Yeah.
The Anacardiaceae.
Yeah. Diptrix.
Diptrix, which is used by the macaws.
Yes. Yeah.
stuff like that. We were
Yeah.
a lot of them, several of them came out to be among our champions.
Yeah.
And so the idea is you'd be creating some habitat usable not by all, but by a good number of species. You'd be increasing food, much better than having overgrown,
Yeah.
underused pastures.
I know you were involved in the establishment of Las Cruces and the negotiations with the Wilson Botanical Garden and how we held on to that. Would you say just a few words ending up?
Well, Bob and Catherine Wilson established Las Cruces, of course, as a botanical garden. They acquired the original woods and so on. I happened to get to know them in '68 when I went there with the botany course as an unofficial field assistant and so on. And somehow or other, I hit it off. I had a decent talking relationship with Mr. Wilson, which was saying something.
Yes.
Because at the time he didn't like OTS students. He had negotiated to get the field station built, and then he found out he was stuck with these students that, I don't know, they messed up his gardens or something. But anyway, he and I always had a speaking relationship. So some years later, Catherine had died, and I had gone down because I was a board member, and so I was available to go down. Of course, I was married at the time to Flor Torres, who was the resident director at the time. So when she had to go, we had to take care of Catherine. I would go down with her or something like that. And then, but he was going to sell it. He was going to give it away. He was never going to give it to OTS. It was very clear. He was extremely hostile. He'd burst into our OTS executive committee meetings and so on, and give diatribes and things. He was really unhappy with OTS, and he felt he'd been mistreated and whatever, and he was not going to fall into that same mistake again by giving his property and so on. Anyway, so it fell to me to negotiate with him and see if he could be convinced, what conditions, how to do it. And we ended up being able to calm him down and convince him that this was his best deal and, best chance. And we guaranteed him he'd have lifetime living rights and access. And he could be the director of the garden part. And, all the plant stuff, it was under his control. I mean, we weren't going to change anything. And we also said we weren't going to do that. We were going to try to expand and improve. But then we had that negotiation done, and we had to present this to the board. I can't remember what year, maybe around 82 or 83. And we had to present it first to the executive committee, and it fell to me. And by that time, I was just starting out as if I recall right, as local hire, resident director. It fell to me to make the presentation. And I was just reminiscing a few minutes ago with Dick White, who was at that meeting, and we all remember that I recommended not keeping it. I said, look, if you look at this as a business proposition, OTS is unstable. OTS has a big problem of, you've got La Selva, it's a major responsibility, and you want to have it in perpetuity, you want to guarantee it, but you could go broke and it would be sold to pay your debts, right? I mean, you're very unstable, and this is not the time to take on another one. I just said, and I put that down as a null hypothesis. I said, my heart would be on the side of you're keeping it, but my mind says, you've got to be very careful. It's not good business right now, and so on. Well, Jay Savage and Barbara Bentley, there was a lot of discussion on the board, but they stood up, there's an executive committee, and they made impassioned speeches, neither of whom were working there, or had worked there, had students there, as I recall. But they thought we should definitely, and they carried the day, and we adopted it. We went on, and so then we said, okay, we're going to take it. We had to look for somebody to run it. And one day, Luis Diego called me up. He had been director of the National Museum. He says, I can't stand the cities and museum and bureaucracy and stuff. Would you hire me down there? And I said, what? Are you kidding? You would go there. Well, he did, and the kind of successes that led to. And we also got started. Based on that, we went on to start seeing how you had to have quasi-endowments. You had to start making financial stuff, and so we set up, I don't know if they're still running or not, we had endowments for each of the field stations that people could give to. They could give to all of OTS, they could give to a field station, there were some other, they could give to the education program, and so on. And I happened to make the first gift to the La Selva Endowment.
That's a great cap, Chuck. Thank you so much. I hope we're able to continue this conversation because I know there's a lot more to say.
Great. Well, thanks for talking to me.
Yeah, thanks, Doug.